Good morning, everybody. Day 3, and we start with a big subject. You know, cyber war on autopilot. This is a big issue, and unfortunately, we are witnessing really now a real war with cyber in it. But what is a cyber war? When President Biden did meet President Putin more than 1 year ago, he argued, you know, if there will be a shooting war between big powers, it will start with a cyber war. But what is a cyber war? We have trade wars, we have ideological wars, we had even football wars. But is there really something like a cyber war, or is it a war is a war is a war? And nobody can speak better about this than Mark, who is in the center of this with the Joint Special Operations University. And so, Mark, is there something like a cyber war? Or how do you see this?
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang, and I'd like to thank ORF and CyFy for having me. And before I start, I obviously have to say that my views do not reflect the United States government, and that's perfectly okay. So what do we mean by cyber war? A lot of things get grouped in with cyber war, cyber espionage, influence operations through cyberspace. You know, I'm a political scientist by nature, so I think of armed conflict between states as warfare, usually resulting in some sort of death. Calling something cyber war would be comparable to going to war on the sea and calling that with a ship and calling that a sea war, or you know, using drones or airplanes and calling that an air war. I think cyber war is something different. Again, I think it gets grouped in with cyber-enabled influence operations, which might be carrying a message through the medium of cyberspace to influence a population, or cyber espionage, getting inside of a network and copying that data, or maybe some sort of subset of cyber espionage, such as covert action, which looks a lot like offensive cyberspace operations, or preparation of the environment, going in and mapping out a network for future actions. So to me, cyber war could be something probably closest to an offensive cyberspace operation. And in my terminology, and the DoD terminology, that would be to delay, disrupt, degrade, destroy, or manipulate an IT system. So I was speaking with Samir on the first day here, and he was talking about how India, they use multi-domain warfare. They use drones in addition to cyberspace, in addition to space. I think that's where we see the most bang for the buck, so to speak, in cyber war, if we're going to call it that. But I think, again, we need to be very careful with what we mean by cyber warfare. In traditional warfare, if you kill somebody, you can't bring them back from the dead, right? If you engage in an offensive cyberspace operation against a server, eventually, if you have the resources, you can bring that system back online. So again, either we need some new terminology, or we just need to be much more careful with what we mean by cyber war. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You know, when NATO declared cyber as the so-called fourth domain, they did not single it out. It was seen in combination to air, sea, and land. On the other hand, you know, cyber is a special thing, and I think the Cyber Peace Institute tried to find out, you know, what are the elements of which are special to cyber. Paulina, can you go a little bit deeper and explain what you have found out in your research?
Thank you. Yes, I would be very careful with calling it cyber war or giving it names. What we are seeing is hybrid war, for sure. Not to forget that on 23rd of February, prior to the kinetic invasion of Ukraine, a wiper malware was sent against its systems. And it was, the systems were successfully protected by a private company. So what we see also in this conflict is a level of coordination between the cyber operations and military operations. How is it planned? We don't know. We don't see inside, but we see a level of coordination. But I would like to take on the previous point on the harm caused to civilians, because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about cyber operations or information operations and propaganda, etc., not having casualties. It's hard to assess the harm. This is very problematic in cyberspace, and we are working toward having methodology, having mechanisms to assess harm caused to especially civilian population. But what we are seeing in this conflict is particularly the emphasis on trying to attack the civilian services, the civilian infrastructure, to cause loss of trust of civilian population. And this is done as much by military means as by cyber means.
Thank you. You know, before the Ukraine war, we had an understanding that wars in the 20th century are death and destruction. In the 21st century, it's chaos and confusion. So now we see both. Jeff was in the Ukraine.
Yeah, just
and so, you know, if we link these theoretical aspects to the real concrete battle now and the war in the Ukraine, what is your...
Well, I think you mentioned something about the fifth domain, right? Cyber is the fifth domain. There was a bit of a debate about should it be the secret sauce sprinkled on top of the other four domains, or is it its own unique domain? And in the United States, they decided it's its own domain, which leads to some interesting thinking. So for example, air, sea, land, and space, I shoot your airplane down, it crashes into the ground. I sink your boat, your submarine, your satellite. But the sea, land, air, and space are still there. But you fight it out in cyberspace, and cyberspace will change, right? The ground will physically change, the routes will change, the applications will change, the operators will change. It's not the same. It's not like the other four domains. This is a dynamic domain that you can wake up the next day and it's completely different. And so part of the concern from people like myself in civil society is you start fighting it out in the fifth domain and the internet changes for our children, right? It becomes a different place and we can never go back. And you're starting to see some of this. There are calls for ICANN to revoke the .ru domain name, CCTLD. There's been demands to change routing. There's been demands to revoke IP addresses. I mean, that is like saying we're removing the Atlantic Ocean or something in the sea. And we're just at the beginning of the first sort of cyber conflict. Imagine if we keep fighting in cyberspace for the next 20 years. The domain will look completely different than it does today. And it seems like we're bumbling into this and we're not thinking it through. And you can look at this also from the perspective of, I think you mentioned other parties getting involved. You're fighting in cyberspace, but who is one of Russia's adversaries? It's Microsoft. Microsoft is releasing reports. Microsoft is stopping campaigns. Like, did Microsoft sign up to be a combatant? Right? And so in cyber, it's sort of like everything is in play and we're pretending like it's fits in a little box, and it doesn't.
Jeff, this is an interesting point because we do not yet have an answer. How the multilateral system is linked in the case of conflict with the multi-stakeholder mechanism. So we have the issue on the table, but there are no mechanisms in place. Chatham House is always for diplomacy. So against the background of this conflict, you know, what diplomacy can do before we go to more details in the Ukraine war, Renate?
Yes, and great to be with you all, and thanks to ORF for this meeting. I mean, I think Ukraine is a fascinating live in-time experience of seeing major war and how cyber interacts with it. And I agree with all the points made by my colleagues, but I would just flag maybe to Paulina's point about civilians are especially a target in cyber, because I think that modern warfare has civilians targeted. The lethality of weapons has increased year by year, decade by decade. Large explosive weapons in populated areas, use of aerial bombing, air attacks is a civilian target. And the relevant ratios between civilian deaths and military deaths has changed profoundly in the 20th century and the 21st. So I see cyber targeting as civilians a continuation of a trend rather than a rupture in that. What I think is different is the targeting of private spaces as opposed to some of the more public spaces of cities, spaces, urban environments that I think is quite distinct and has a dimension that Jeff and others have mentioned. On the diplomacy and on the side of it, what are we seeing in Ukraine? And what might that tell us about the future of cybersecurity? We're seeing first, as Jeff mentioned, an incredible amount of engagement by private sector actors, large Microsoft companies, and retaliation on the Russian side too, where the Russians have now openly invited copying of patents and systems in response to being excluded from the international system. So what does that mean for cross-combatants, and what does that mean for multi-stakeholder dialogue? I think what it is going to profoundly change is any future multi-stakeholder dialogue around cybersecurity. It's very hard now to see why the private sector could not be involved in it if the private sector is critical to the planning, the conduct, the monitoring and the lessons learning of any military activities. And that's a profound game changer. I leave Jeff to speak about the hackers, but the other point I would just bring out about the engagement of the private sector and what that might mean for future discussions and diplomacy is the cost issue. We've seen it with the Elon Musk discussions around Starlink and who pays the bill. But the question of long-term sustainability of an engagement costs companies. The cost to Amazon of support, the cost to Google, the cost to Microsoft. We have some of those colleagues here and can share with us. But that is a significant outlay for companies that is going to, I think, distinguish between what I would call the big companies, the large companies that can be involved in multinational, multilateral processes versus the more rub-a-dub companies that don't have the assets, spare assets to employ and engage in these contexts. So I think the private sector and the multilateral structures are going to deploy going forward. The second thing that I think, just to flag, and I'll stop here, is that I think this cyber war is changing what we understand to be the powers of the relationship between a population and its state in conflict. We're seeing civilians both being targeted, as Pavlina said, but we're also seeing civilians as part of the army of support. We're seeing civilian journalists uncovering war crimes. We're seeing GPS and information being openly shared and assets. That is going to change, I think, the discussion of where civilian community and the relations of communication between a state and a population in conflict.
Okay, thank you, Renate. Mark, you have already outlined in your first intervention, the broad range of activities from espionage to disinformation campaigns. So, but, the Ukraine war is probably the first real shooting war where cyber plays a direct role, a hidden role. We have not all information. So, but with your experiences, is this the start of a new beginning? Is this a game changer? Or what are the first lessons we learned, let's say, not only for cyber, but for the future of the world, from this war?
Sure. So I think a major lesson learned is that you need to prepare for the future, prepare for conflict, build in resiliency. One of the biggest mistakes that Putin made after invading Ukraine in 2014 was stopping his invasion in 2014. That gave the United States government 8 years to help out the Ukrainians and to help prepare them for when the Russians came back. Last night I pulled a few numbers on this. The United States government has provided $20.3 billion in security force assistance to the Ukrainians since 2014. In addition to that, U.S. Special Operations Command and U.S. Cyber Command have both led the way in helping out the Ukrainians. And I want to be very clear, it's the Ukrainians doing the fighting. We can train them, we can educate them all that we want, but it's the Ukrainians who have to execute at the end of the day, and they have definitely done that. So U.S. Special Operations Command has provided training and education to Ukrainian special forces, has helped to educate them in the art of resistance, and that includes helping to add a resistance company to each of 3 Ukrainian brigades. Over the past 8 years, we've also helped out with military information support operations to help counter mis- and disinformation by the Russians. Cyber Command, as I mentioned, has also played a big role in this. They've, as part of their persistent engagement initiative, have deployed a hunt forward team to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians find vulnerabilities in their systems and address threats to their systems. To be very clear, it was not Cyber Command who fixed these problems for them. They sat side by side with their Ukrainian colleagues and just helped provide a little bit of guidance to them. In addition to that, from General Nakasoni's recent testimony to Congress, he shared that we've shared threat intelligence with the Ukrainians, and in fact, U.S. Cyber Command has engaged in offensive cyberspace operations against the Russians, okay? So why don't we hear about this in the news? This information is out there. You have to dig for it a little bit. But for both of these communities, the Special Operations community and the Cybercom community, their missions are most successful when you don't hear about them. They work in the shadows. They work to enable their partners from the shadows. And they try not to take too much credit. Because again, at the end of the day, it's up to the Ukrainians to execute. Thank you.
Pavlina, you mentioned also the disinformation as an element of it. So on the one hand, this is not new. So in the Cold War, we had Radio Free Europe and we had Radio Moscow. So ideological war was with the Cold War was an element on it. So and now disinformation is part of what we call in this cyber domain because they are using now social platforms and all these new elements in cyberspace. So do you see any difference between the ideological war in the, let's say, in the Cold War and the disinformation campaign now in around the Ukraine war?
Thank you. Yes, yes, definitely, because you have different capabilities. Disinformation is as old as history of humanity. And of war, waging war, but you have very different capabilities. You have technology which empowers individuals to take part, and I will also point later the spillover effect of this war thanks to this factor. But you have technologies which amplify your voice with whatever you do, and you can target your audience. And this is extremely changing the landscape because it gives individuals as well as states different powers, and we see it in cyber operations and information operations conducted through platforms or other means. And also technology has progressed. We had these examples of deepfakes, or stealing or hacking accounts or defacements, etc. So it very much changed the capabilities which can be done through misinformation and disinformation, and this has very direct impact on the population. But I wanted to come on one point what is also new in this conflict and what is stemming from the work of Cyber Peace Institute are two main factors. One is the spillover effect. And not to forget, with cyber operations, it's much more difficult to target specific infrastructure point or specific facility, and sometimes the effect is unpredictable, how the networks are connected. And what we recorded in our database is that the conflict in Ukraine not only damaged the countries which are in the conflict itself as Ukraine, but Ukraine, by the way, was the second most targeted country even prior to the conflict. So it was the ground for trying cyber operations prior to the conflict. Is the second most targeted country after the US. But with the launch of the military operation, we see we see increase in cyber attacks on Ukraine, on Russia, and on 30 other countries, and different kinds of sectors. It's energy sectors, transport, ICT sector. So this war is causing destabilization of cyberspace as such. And this is a problem with using cyber weapons. And one more point I would like to take is that we see also different nation-state actors. And we mentioned this, who is taking part in it. We see different private companies being involved in defense. We see collectives, which again, maybe with the best aim in the heart, but it's spreading the cyber operations and the means and enabling individuals to take part in the conflict, which is again very difficult for the for the attribution in cyberspace and on application of international law and international humanitarian law, who is being combat and who is being civilian. And we see cyber criminal groups which have engaged in this cyber attacks and operation in the context of the armed conflict on behalf of the belligerents. So this is causing very problematic questions for the applicability of law, as I mentioned, and the overall attribution, whether on technical, political, or legal levels.
Okay, thank you. What we see indeed is this growing complexity, and the clear red lines are disappearing, and everything is mixed. You mentioned individuals and corporations. Jeff, you also mentioned the individual hackers, and Microsoft non-state actors are playing a much bigger role. So this is not totally new. In the Middle Ages, we had the pirates on the oceans, and and they acted as private ship owners,
right.
But with the support of some governments. As long as you attack the ship of our enemy, then we harbor you.
Right.
So that means, are we back in the Middle Ages now if it comes to cyber? And how we can make sense of this complexity where state, non-state actors, patriot hackers, private IT armies are mingled into this complexity.
I find it fascinating from politics don't normally are not normally involved in the technical world, right? I don't know the political leanings of half my friends because it just doesn't come up. But what's occurring now is this Ukrainian-Russian conflict is sorting people, companies essentially, into buckets. We're in this sorting phase of, we see this botnet operators. I'm for Russia, I'm against Russia, I'm attacking Ukraine, I'm attacking Russia, right? It's causing criminals to get sorted into buckets, it's causing companies to get sorted. And what's occurring is you're either sort of for that rule of law, you're sort of for the authoritarian Russian model, or you're undecided. And everybody's fighting over these buckets. And what's interesting is anybody can play, right? You pointed that anybody can play in Cyberwar now. And Ukraine actually called for people to support them. And the United States was like, whoa, 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 let's not do that. But anybody can play from anywhere in the world. And that's not like a fighter wanting to go to Afghanistan to fight and having to travel to Afghanistan. That's somebody on their off time going down and working on their computer to participate in this conflict. Like, that's new. And that has led to sort of this recognition that there's a pool of groups out there where I'm calling them, or they're called super empowered individuals. They could be super empowered companies. And so, for example, right now, a lot of us use email. Our email uses spam blacklists to prevent you from getting spam. Some of the people that operate these spam blacklists, black hole lists, they're individuals, they're small groups. And so, but if they decide to put your domain on their spam blacklist, you don't get my email. Your company won't get email. So they're really empowered. A few people can basically determine if your company gets email or not by putting it on a black hole list. Well, let's say these super empowered individuals are siding with Ukraine and decide to black hole Russian addresses. Well, they could. I mean, so now as a consumer or somebody running a mail system, you're going to have to decide, well, do I get my black hole list from that group or that group? And take that and explode it across everything in technology. My software updates. And what's going on here is, at the ultimate end of it, imagine if Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook decides he's all in for Ukraine. What does that mean, right? Does that mean that only bad advertising goes to Russia? Does that mean they get disconnected? Does that mean all influence ops? They were never a player on the field before. And companies and super empowered individuals will be players, are players. And you have to acknowledge that in your diplomacy, right? And I think not allowing them to have a seat at the table means they're going to go and do what they want anyway. And a lot of them are doing, so for example, US started imposing sanctions. And at one point, what was it, NetNod, it was the Ukrainian, the UK registrar, Nominet. Thank you, Nominet. Yeah, Nominet gets together with their lawyers and they're like, what should we do? Does this impact our registration business? And they said, well, Visa and MasterCard aren't going to process in Russia, so you probably shouldn't process. And the board got really nervous and said, okay, that's it. We're not going to renew domain names in Russia. So now you can't renew because you can't process your credit cards. So now you have all these Russian domain names that are going to expire and the legitimate owners can't renew them. So does that mean someone buys them and squats on them? Like the third order, second order effects are crazy, and all these companies are trying to do is do the right thing. And so I have a feeling, you start off as Cyberwar and it sounds very sexy, and then it devolves quickly into, hey, I can't renew my domain name.
Yeah, it has tremendous unexpected side effects, and we do not know how far these waves go. You mentioned the request from the Ukraine minister to remove .ru and .rf from the root server, and ICANN fortunately made a decision to protect the infrastructure and to say, we do not have Chinese air and American air, we have polluted air or clean air. So because I think this basic infrastructure should remain neutral, but there are several attacks, and in ICANN we're talking about DNS abuse, so that means you can certainly abuse this. But this brings really new challenges to the future also of diplomacy. It took a couple of hundreds of years until the pirates were brought under a regime in Paris in 1856, so after 200 years of negotiations. So do we have time for another 200 years of negotiations to get the private IT army and the patrioted hackers under control?
Well, I'm not sure that we're going to have something like we had in tackling the pirates, where we're going to pull the states together in a nice palace in Paris and everybody's going to sign a treaty and that's going to be how we engage. I would just flag a little bit. I think the focus is too much on the immediate impact of the cyber war right now. We're looking at the questions of integrated planning. We're looking at what sort of attacks. Where I think Jeff and others are saying is we need to be looking much further out. And one thing I think it will absolutely do is accelerate moves towards splinternet and accelerate the potential for you to have complete separate development of standards, systems, and frameworks. And we've been talking about the splinternet primarily in the context of China, US, but I think Ukraine-Russian conflict will accelerate that to a significant step forward. So where to position yourself in that context and how to prevent that is one big thing that I would flag, should be much more attention. The second thing is probably the diplomacy of sanctions will need to change, where when we think about the economic effect on sanctions, we need to look a lot more beyond the targeting of the state industry and state-owned enterprises and much more the impact on the private sector to a lot longer and commercial transactions, especially in and around domain name and users' services. But on to the diplomacy and your point, I think my sense is that we need to move quite quickly from the official UN-sponsored multilateral processes to a more structured and system level of participation of key multilateral private sector actors in. The second aspect that I would say is I think it's changing the debate around the nature of what sort of cyber deals are made by large states. You recall that in June 2021, we had the discussions in Geneva between President Biden and President Putin about some forms of cyber agreements or security. Well, I think that's going to change how we think about cyber negotiations and structures, because in a way, they're modeled at the moment on arms control arrangements. They're modeled on transparency arrangements, verification arrangements, mutually assured destruction type deterrence mechanisms. Those aren't working. In a cyber context where espionage is a driver, your adversary has transparency on many of your actions. Your adversary has insight into many of your black box elements. So the key, I think, is going to have to be changing to transparency with allies. What do we see in Ukraine? We see a fundamental opening of Ukraine's own attempts at cyber with its allies, with its partners, with its engagements. So I think it actually, to turn it on its head, it's going to be less about the diplomacy between adversaries and much more about what are we prepared to share with our allies? What sort of technology are states prepared to share with private sector and private sector prepared to share with states? And what are we prepared to inform our populations about? And to that extent as well. So I think we're going to see differences in understanding what is the forms of transparency, what is the forms of dialogue, and what's the information sharing that's going on. But that's going to be much more the driver than, I think, having a regulation of violation or compliance or punition, given that the challenges of, we said, attribution, punishment, and prohibitions.
Thank you, Renate. By the way, I will open the discussion now for questions from the floor. That means give me a signal if you want to ask a question. But first, you know, Mark and Paulina, is transparency an element of the way forward to confidence building, reducing conflict, and, you know, channeling, certain forms of conflict into a more peaceful future?
Thank you. I just wanted to come back on one point in the discussion, and then I will come back to your question. And it's sometimes, you know, as we also discuss it in this panel, like sometimes how we refer to private actors, we refer to them like they were operating in a vacuum, and it's not so. While they're increasing their power, increasing their involvement, often for a good cause, often for protection of their customers, often for defense, often for more stability. So their role is by far not negative, but while there are many important questions to be answered on their involvement, but when we are discussing the private actors and platforms, etc., I think, and with the questions which arose shortly after the conflict, we mentioned the ICANN case of the domain for Russians, etc. It's important to, and it's a very thin line between being neutral, which is often for the resilience of the system and for cyber peace and peace in general, very important, and being an enabler. And that was often the question: are we enabling more offense? Are we enabling more casualties? And we don't want to be enabler in this war. And this was an important question to be answered by private companies. And they don't operate without any scrutiny. Maybe they still operate in a rather fluid situation when it comes to we discussed in this event, regulation, legal provisions, etc. But they still have pressure of states, they have pressure of international community, and when it comes to very public actors and large platforms, especially, it's also the public pressure and their response, and they really, with this conflict, they really try to adjust their response and they try to do the right thing. I think whether we can assess how successful this was or wasn't. But the focus should be always, and when we are also discussing, and I'm coming to your second point, when we are discussing more resilience and whether diplomatic efforts, important is also focusing on technological resilience. But we need to have the focus on civilians. So as we are looking for the line between neutrality and enabling more conflict, we have to look on how to contribute to the cyber peace.
Okay, thank you. I have 3 questions, and then we come back, you know, for a final round. And Mark and Jeff, I want to hear your comment on whether transparency and confidence-building measures is a source of hope. Probably not now, but in the future, because at the end of, we have to have something like cyber stability. So the first 2 questions from here and 1 question from there.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. My question is for Jeff. I want to pull the thread of what Renata was saying regarding Splinternet and frame it in the context of Web3, this desire for ownership and independence and freedom. And I wanted to ask you what you thought, what you're seeing in the cyber domain, what paths you're seeing that we're walking towards this kind of Splinternet, towards this independence, everybody doing their own thing in their own way. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael.
Michael Nelson with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Great panel. You covered a lot of different topics. I particularly think it was useful that Mark started off with the definitional problem. One of the reasons we can't communicate with the Russians and get any kind of agreement is we Americans march in and want to talk about cyber attacks, and they want to talk about information warfare, which is everything you mentioned, and the BBC, and C-SPAN, and CNN. So we don't even talk the same language. My question, though, is about another term, which hasn't been mentioned, and that is cognitive warfare. So rather than trying to defend our machines, we're trying to defend the brains of our citizens. I think the term's useful because it does get us to focus on how to build better defenses between the eyeballs and the brain. If the Russians are feeding us disinformation, it would be very helpful if the people receiving it knew how to dismiss what isn't true. So any thoughts on that, and particularly any examples of countries that are doing it well? I know a lot about Taiwan. They've been dealing with Chinese disinformation, and they have something called Fight Rumor with Humor. I know Finland does a lot on media literacy, but any thoughts on cognitive warfare and how to build better defenses in our citizens' brains?
Thank you. Excellent point. And the third question.
My name is Kshitij Aditya Singh. I'm the Managing Director of Knowledge Advisory. My question is to Mark. I'll preface it with a short comment. We've moved into network-centric warfare over the last 15 to 20 years, both for critical infrastructure and kinetic abilities, whether it is the battlefield or your defensive establishment. So my question to you, in context of what is happening in India, sort of integration of our commands, command structures, is with respect to network-centric warfare, deployment of CBRNE assets, both defensive and offensive, what are 3 lessons we could take from the US strategically, either tactical lessons or strategic principles, if you could shed some light on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 3 excellent questions. Splinternet, AI, future. My proposal is we have 7 minutes left, that we go from the right. Mark, you start, and we end up with a final comment for Renate, for the lady. Mark.
Sure. Thank you for those questions. They're very good. Regarding cognitive warfare, I recently wrote a paper in Lawfare called Taking the Elf Off the Shelf that focused on countries like Estonia and how they're trying to build in wetware resiliency, trying to make their population more resilient against mis and disinformation, pointing out accurate sources of information, how to determine whether something is true or false, picking out how certain organizations put a spin on the news. So as an educator, I'm probably going to naturally default to we need a lot more education. I think in the United States, we've defunded education for the past 20 or 30 years, and it's starting to show. You have people who believe some just plainly crazy things, that had they been educated early on the accuracy of sources and how to determine whether something is true or false, we might not be in some of the situations that we are today. Regarding the other question about lessons learned, I'm going to go the completely opposite way of the way you wanted me to go. I think that in the United States, we've become overly reliant on technology solutions. We've lost the focus on the human being. We think that technology will solve all of our problems, and we're often ignorant of the technology that we think will solve our problems. And the vendors are taking advantage of that. They know that the United States government has lots of money to throw around, and they're making all types of promises about AI solutions. And oftentimes those AI solutions don't work well with each other. So taking those imperfect technology solutions and placing them onto aging weapons systems, I think is just a recipe for disaster. So if I could give you a lesson learned, it would be to develop critical thinking, empathy, learning about the others' points of view. I disagree with Putin's point of view on Ukraine, but at least I understand it. So it's kind of weird being on a technology panel saying technology is not going to help us out. Again, I think we need to go back to the human and back to education.
Thank you. I really like the point on cognitive warfare, and we touched upon it on this panel already. But what we see is also evolution in cyber attacks going eventually against the trust of population. First, they started to, with the first cyber attacks, they were more data-related, as data breaches, etc. Then it was more systematic on infrastructure systems, etc. Now, what we see with a variety of attacks which we recorded in Ukraine, it's more about eroding the trust and the level of security and determination etc. among population. This has, as it was mentioned, this has a very long-term effect, because if you have a population which is not trusting the sources, which cannot rely on them, it leads to very difficult, not addressed security needs at the point. But in the long term, you will have people who are very ready to believe disinformation, or you have people who are very afraid of taking on digital transformation and digital means, and it's just it can very much deteriorate your economic prospects as a whole country in the future, in the long term. So there are many processes which can start with this destabilization of trust, which we can only, which we will be basically seeing in the long future. And I think the lessons we can take are also looking to countries which have been acknowledging this as a problem for a long time, because they have been targeted for a long time, and we only recognize this as a large-scale urgent issue right now, especially with the connection to the conflict. But countries like Finland and Estonia, they have often amazing resources for and ways for increasing resilience of the whole society and of their systems. And it was some months ago, large-scale cyber attack on Estonia, which was unsuccessful. We are discussing cyber attacks, and it doesn't mean they are successful. They are often stopped. You can increase the defense can be more effective than the offense, and we are seeing it now. And I would just like to second the points of definitely education, raising awareness, and coordination between different actors as private companies, states, but also civil society and academia.
Thank you. Jeff.
I liked your question about the splinternet, and it feeds into something I mentioned earlier, which is I believe that we are in this great sorting period. And just to elaborate on that a little bit, basically, I don't like this. I'm a former ICANN person, so I believe in an open and transparent, interoperable internet. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to sort ourselves into 3 buckets. It's going to be the rule of law buckets, whether you call it the like-minded countries, whatever you want to call that. There's going to be the rule of law bucket, there's going to be the team authoritarian bucket, and there's going to be everybody else, the unsorted. And those 2 big buckets are going to be trying to do anything they can do to convince team undecided to join them, right? And you can see this occurring already. Team rule of law, what are the strengths of team rule of law? Well, transparency, right? If you have a disagreement, if Apple has a disagreement over the FBI trying to get access to an iPhone, they can go to court and the world gets to watch what happens. In team authoritarian, nobody gets to go to court and there is no transparency. And so the world is going to sort themselves into, well, what kind of future, what kind of norms, what kind of do they want? And along this path, there's going to be terrible conflict and fighting. When you sort into these buckets, vulnerabilities in the West or in America, we talk about vulnerabilities that we find. 0-day vulnerabilities. They get announced on mailing lists. People patch them and fix them. In China, they're passing laws to prevent that, right? The vulnerabilities have to go to the government first. So you can see that these forks are already happening. And which side you kind of want to be on. And unfortunately, European Union and others are accelerating Splinternet by doing things such as with GDPR and enforced data localization. That's a problem, data localization in China. Once your company, once you're Microsoft and you have to do data localization in China or Europe, and you've learned how to do data localization once, it's really easy to do it 10 times or 100 times, which means it's really easy for all the other countries in the world to force data localization. Because what are the costs now? The sunken costs are already done. So well-meaning but unintended side effects are going to be the acceleration of Splinter, whether we meant it or not.
Yeah, unfortunately, Renata, you have 0 seconds. A very brief final comment.
Yeah, let me just bring it back to people. I think what we see in Ukraine is that cyber's effectiveness is a weapon of stealth. But when you're needing to undertake large-scale territorial aggression, large-scale territorial invasion, you need large-scale communication. The second thing we're seeing is significant cyber attack is effective when it has a surprise component. When you continually target a country and when you have continual information warfare, as Katrina said, the effects limit, or Pavlina said. So there is a paradox with cyber. Its stealth is its weakness, just as it is its strength, and the sustained information war is its weakness as it is its strength. So I just wanted to echo those points.
What a great panel. Give them a hand.